The footage in today's stories recorded events that would later horrify anyone who watched. Hi, I'm Nathan, and this is a look at the most disturbing deaths caught on CCTV. From a bitter tunnel reunion where only one walked out alive, to an elderly woman who opened her door to the wrong person, and a discovery that will shock everyone. It was January 23, 2018. In downtown Omaha, Nebraska, a pedestrian underpass sat beneath one of the city's busiest roads, connecting both sides of the downtown district. Hundreds of people use it every day. Noah Madsen was 28 years old and had just finished the final day of a certification course related to his job. The classes had kept him away from home for several days, and with his backpack over one shoulder and a travel mug still in hand, he began the short walk toward the parking lot where he had left his car. The only thing on his mind was getting home. Halfway to the underpass, Noah noticed another man approaching from the opposite direction. It was Adam White, 30, someone he hadn't seen in years. The two weren't strangers. Years earlier, they had briefly worked together on a small business venture that ultimately failed. While Noah rebuilt his life and found success elsewhere, Adam became increasingly bitter each time he saw Noah moving forward while he felt left behind. You never really know what someone has been carrying around all these years. Something that became a footnote in your life can still be the biggest chapter in someone else's. Adam wasted little time bringing up the failed business. He demanded that Noah finally admit he had been responsible for what happened years earlier. Noah told him he was on his way home after several days away and didn't have time to revisit the past. He suggested they talk another day before continuing toward the underpass. Adam wasn't ready to let the conversation end there. Inside the tunnel, footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as people continued passing through in both directions. Some headed toward nearby office buildings, while others made their way to parking garages after work. The underpass never stayed empty for long, but people rarely stopped walking. The conversation continued. What began as an awkward exchange quickly turned into old accusations. Adam insisted Noah had ruined his life. Noah pushed back, telling him the business had failed years ago and there was nothing left to argue about. He tried ending the conversation more than once, but Adam continued following beside him. I think Adam really had enough. And we all know how dangerous it can be when someone reaches their breaking point. By the time they reached the middle section of the tunnel, they had moved beyond the view of the entrance cameras. The argument became louder. A few pedestrians glanced toward them before continuing on. Arguments between adults weren't exactly unusual in a public walkway, so most people simply kept walking. That's when Adam suddenly pulled out a knife. Noah immediately backed away and tried to put some distance between them, but the narrow underpass offered little room to escape. Adam continued advancing as the confrontation spilled farther down the tunnel. Noah attempted to defend himself and break free, but the attack continued for several moments before he finally collapsed to the ground. By then, he had suffered multiple sharp force injuries. Adam immediately fled the scene on foot. It wasn't long before another group of pedestrians entered the tunnel and found Noah lying on the ground. They immediately called 911. Paramedics arrived within minutes and began treating him where he had fallen before transporting him to a nearby hospital. Despite their efforts, the injuries had caused catastrophic blood loss. Noah Madsen died shortly afterward. The underpass immediately became a crime scene. Cameras at both entrances recorded Noah and Adam entering the tunnel together. Minutes later, Adam was seen leaving alone before emergency responders arrived. Together with forensic evidence and witness accounts, the footage established a clear timeline and quickly identified the suspect. Witness statements, forensic evidence, and the surveillance footage ultimately identified Adam as the person responsible for the killing. He was arrested, prosecuted, and later convicted of Noah's murder. The death was ruled a homicide. It's unsettling what years of anger can do to a person. Left alone long enough, it can completely change what someone believes they're capable of. The next story starts with an elderly woman trying to help a struggling relative, and the most disturbing part of the case came only after her death. It was April 7th, 2017. In Springfield, Missouri, a quiet spring afternoon unfolded across a residential neighborhood. The neighborhood was the kind of place where unusual activity rarely went unnoticed. Security cameras quietly recorded the afternoon as residents went about their day. Judith Penrose was 73 years old. She had lived in the same house for years, and after being widowed, continued living there on her own. Since she lived alone, one of her relatives had recently helped install a small security camera overlooking the main living area. mainly to give everyone a little extra peace of mind. A few weeks earlier, Judith's nephew, Ben Penrose, 26, had become increasingly unstable. Family members noticed he had grown deeply paranoid, convinced that relatives were secretly working against him and trying to ruin his life. Ordinary conversations often ended in arguments, and no amount of reassurance seemed to change his mind. Concerned for everyone involved, the family tried to support him, but nobody believed the situation would turn violent. That afternoon, Ben arrived at Judith's home. Family members visited before, and neighbors had no reason to pay attention. There was certainly no reason for Judith to think opening the door would become the worst decision of her life. After all, the person standing at her door wasn't a stranger. The visit began normally enough. The two spent time talking inside the house, and for a while there was nothing to suggest the afternoon would end differently than any previous visit. As the hours passed, Ben's suspicions resurfaced. He accused Judith of siding with other family members and insisted she had been part of the conspiracy he believed existed against him. Judith repeatedly tried to reassure him that nobody was plotting against him, but every attempt only seemed to make him angrier. At some point, an argument developed. Nobody outside heard what was said. The neighborhood remained calm, while the small security camera inside the living room continued recording. Judith attempted to calm the situation, but the argument eventually turned physical. Ben shoved her before striking her repeatedly in the head. Judith tried to shield herself and back away, but there was little she could do to stop the attack. After several more blows, she collapsed onto the floor. Given her age, the injuries were devastating. As horrifying as the attack already was, I don't think anything could have prepared me for what happened next. Rather than leaving immediately, Ben remained inside the residence for hours. As evening settled over the neighborhood, he was seen entering and leaving the house several times. When he finally walked away later that night, he left behind a scene that would shock even experienced investigators. The post-mortem examination later confirmed that Judith had been decapitated after her death. The following afternoon, another family member arrived at Judith's house. Receiving no answer, they let themselves inside with a spare key. The quiet home quickly gave way to a horrifying discovery, and police were called immediately. When authorities entered the residence, they quickly realized they were dealing with a homicide. Investigators secured the scene and began reviewing footage from Judith's indoor security camera, along with surveillance recordings from neighboring homes. Together with the physical evidence, the recordings established a detailed timeline before and after the killing. Additional evidence was later recovered from multiple locations connected to the case. A post-mortem examination determined that Judith died from blunt force head trauma sustained during the attack. Investigators also concluded that the decapitation occurred after death and was not the cause of death itself. The investigation ultimately led authorities to Ben, who was later arrested. The death was ruled a homicide. It's difficult enough to imagine violence coming from a stranger. For Judith, the person responsible was someone she knew well enough to invite into her home. Meanwhile, in Phoenix, Arizona, a woman leaving work was about to learn how quickly a routine walk to her car can become something far worse. It was November 15, 2016. In Phoenix, Arizona, a large shopping center was settling into the quieter part of the evening. Customers drifted toward the parking lot as stores prepared to close. Whitney McCall was 24 years old. She had been working at the shopping center for some time and was looking forward to heading home after another routine shift. The only thing left to do was make the short walk to her car. As her shift ended, Whitney gathered her belongings and walked toward the parking lot. Like most people leaving work, she was probably thinking about what came next, rather than what was happening around her. A short distance away, another vehicle had already been in the area for some time. The vehicle entered and left different sections of the shopping center several times throughout the evening. Nothing about the movements appeared especially suspicious at the time. It was only after Whitney disappeared that investigators began paying closer attention to its presence in the area. The driver was Russell Gomez, 34. He hadn't come to the shopping center looking for Whitney specifically. Instead, he spent the evening driving through different sections of the parking lot, watching people leave alone while waiting for an opportunity. In a parking lot that size, one more vehicle wasn't enough to draw anyone's attention. That's exactly what made it so easy to miss. As the evening continued, storefronts began closing and the number of people outside steadily dropped. Large sections of the parking lot had become noticeably quieter by the time Whitney left work. For a while, there was nothing to suggest anything was wrong. The same vehicle remained in the area. Security cameras captured portions of Whitney's route across the lot, though Though, like many large shopping centers, not every area was fully visible. Rows of parked vehicles created blind spots between camera angles. A person could disappear from one view and remain unseen for several moments before appearing in another. A few seconds out of view doesn't sound like much, but on a night like this, it was all the time someone needed. Russell continued circling the shopping center, waiting for the right opportunity. At some point near her vehicle, Whitney encountered the driver. What happened next unfolded within one of the parking lot's blind spots. Later, evidence showed that she had been forced into the waiting vehicle before she could attract meaningful attention. The encounter lasted only a short time. By the time anyone might have realized something was wrong, Whitney was already gone. Shortly afterward, surveillance footage recorded a vehicle leaving the shopping center. Nobody watching the vehicle leave would have known Whitney was inside. She never returned home. At first, family members assumed something had delayed her. As the hours passed without contact, however, concern gradually turned into alarm. By the following day, Whitney had been reported missing. As investigators reviewed surveillance footage from the shopping center, they began piecing together her final known movements. Cameras documented her arrival at work, her shift, and eventually her walk into the parking lot. After that, the trail became much harder to follow. By then, Whitney was already being transported away from the city. Location evidence later showed that Whitney had been taken far from the shopping center where she was last seen. Investigators eventually traced her movements to a remote rural area outside the city. At some point after arriving there, Whitney was restrained. She was held for a period of time before being killed. A ligature was eventually used to strangle her. Unlike many other forms of homicide, strangulation is rarely instantaneous. It takes several minutes, making it a prolonged and deliberate act. By the time it was over, Whitney was dead. Days later, investigators located Whitney's body in a remote rural area after evidence gathered during the investigation helped narrow the search. A post-mortem examination confirmed that she died from ligature strangulation, and her death was ruled a homicide. The investigation continued for months. Surveillance footage from the shopping center became one of the most important pieces of evidence. Additional information from phone records, vehicle sightings, and witness statements helped establish a detailed timeline of events leading up to the abduction and murder. Investigators ultimately concluded that Whitney had not been personally targeted. Russell had spent hours driving through the shopping center looking for someone leaving alone, and Whitney simply happened to cross his path at the wrong moment. The evidence ultimately identified Russell as the person responsible for Whitney's murder. He was later arrested, prosecuted, and convicted. Some killers rely on isolation. Others rely on anger. On the industrial outskirts of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a man's attempt to settle a personal dispute was about to end in flames. But before we continue, if you're enjoying the video, I'd really appreciate you hitting subscribe. Now back at it. It was August 17th, 2015. On the industrial outskirts of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the summer heat lingered long after sunset. Most businesses had already closed, leaving the area quiet and largely empty. Colin Renner was 34 years old. He worked seasonal construction jobs and often picked up extra work whenever it was available. Friends described him as practical and hardworking. In the weeks leading up to August 17th, however, he had become involved in an increasingly bitter financial dispute. Work wasn't always steady, so he took every opportunity he could to earn extra income. The disagreement centered on money owed for construction work Colin had completed weeks earlier. The other party disputed the amount, and neither side had been willing to accept the other's terms. Phone calls had turned into arguments, and arguments had gradually turned into mutual frustration. Neither side appeared willing to let the matter go. Eventually, a face-to-face meeting was arranged. That evening, Colin left to meet the other individual and discuss the dispute in person. From his perspective, it may have seemed like the quickest way to finally settle the issue. Disagreements over money happen every day. However, arguments like these have a way of growing beyond the money itself. The meeting took place in an industrial area where few people were around. From the beginning, it was clear neither side had come expecting to compromise. Whatever had been said over the phone in previous days hadn't eased the tension. Within minutes, the confrontation turned violent. The discussion quickly slipped back into the same accusations they'd been making for days. Neither side seemed willing to back down, and every attempt to settle the disagreement only made the frustration worse. Before long, the confrontation turned physical. Colin was assaulted during the confrontation. The attack left him injured and unable to effectively defend himself. The violence continued beyond the initial assault, making it clear this was no longer a spontaneous fight between two angry people. Colin was left incapacitated, leaving him unable to escape once he was moved from the original meeting location. Instead of calling for help or leaving him behind, find, the men responsible chose to take him somewhere far more isolated. Once Colin was no longer able to resist, he was loaded into a vehicle and driven away from the original meeting location. The area they drove to was darker and further removed from any passing traffic. At some stage during the night, a fire was intentionally started inside a vehicle. Confined spaces become especially dangerous during vehicle fires because heat and smoke build rapidly. Within minutes, thick smoke had filled the cabin as the fire spread through the interior. Colin remained trapped inside with no realistic means of escape. The fire continued growing until the vehicle was engulfed. It wasn't until a passing driver noticed flames from a nearby roadway and called emergency services that help was requested. By the time firefighters arrived, the fire was already well developed. There was no possibility of rescue. A post-mortem examination later determined that Colin died from a combination of smoke inhalation and thermal injuries sustained during the fire. Investigators later determined that an accelerant had been used to start the fire. Burn patterns at the scene and the presence of residue were inconsistent with an accidental ignition. Although the assault itself happened out of view, nearby security cameras documented the vehicle's movements before and after the crime. Combined with phone records, witness statements, and forensic evidence, the footage allowed investigators to reconstruct much of Colin's final hours. Even so, the available evidence was not enough to conclusively identify the people responsible. Authorities ruled Colin's death a homicide and continued pursuing leads for years, but no arrests were ever made. The case ultimately remained unsolved. Personal disputes often feel temporary while they're happening. For Colin, a disagreement over money became something far more permanent than either side could have imagined. The next story starts with an evening visit between acquaintances and ends with a reminder that some crimes leave far more evidence behind than the killer expects. It was October 9, 2018. In Portland, Maine, a quiet weekday evening settled over a suburban apartment complex. Residents returned home from work, parking lots filled with vehicles, and people moved between buildings without paying much attention to one another. Melanie Cormier was 31 years old and lived alone in the apartment. She was good at keeping old friendships alive, even when life became busy. That evening, one of those friends was coming over to visit. There was nothing unusual about the arrangement. The two had known each other for years, and from the outside, the visit appeared completely routine. Shortly after arriving at the complex, Nick Charleston, 35, entered Melanie's apartment. They had remained close friends for years, though Nick had recently begun hoping their relationship might become something more. Melanie had no reason to believe the visit would be any different from the many before it. The evening began normally enough. The two spent time talking inside the apartment while the rest of the complex settled into its usual nighttime routine. Neighbors returned home, television switched on, and people prepared for another workday in the morning. The evening continued for several hours behind closed doors. As the conversation unfolded, Nick admitted he wanted their relationship to become something more than friendship. Melanie gently but firmly told him she didn't feel the same way. Nick refused to accept her answer, and before long she was trying to end the visit. She made her way toward the front door. He followed close behind. As Melanie reached the apartment entrance, Nick grabbed her arm and tried to stop her from leaving. She pulled away and demanded that he let go. The apartment door swung open as the struggle spilled into view of a hallway security camera. Nick struck her across the head with the handgun. The blow sent her reeling toward the open doorway. Dazed and bleeding, Melanie instinctively tried to get into the hallway. Before she could make it more than a few steps, Nick raised the firearm. The camera captured Melanie collapsing just inside the doorway before Nick pulled her back into the apartment and shut the door. The shooting itself lasted only seconds. What followed would occupy the rest of the night. Outside, security cameras continued recording. At first, the activity appeared ordinary. People carry boxes to vehicles all the time. They move belongings, make trips to their cars, and return to their apartments. But this activity continued for hours. Nick returned to the parked vehicle several times throughout the night. Some trips involved bags, others involved containers. The pattern became increasingly difficult to explain as the night went on. Eventually, a large storage container became part of the effort. Moving a body out of an apartment is neither quick nor easy. Hallways, parking lots, stairwells, and neighboring units all create opportunities to be seen. Every trip increased the risk that someone would notice something unusual. Even so, the process continued. By the early hours of the morning, Melanie's body had been placed inside the container and loaded into the vehicle. The vehicle eventually left the apartment complex and traveled toward a wooded area outside the city. The location was secluded and unlikely to attract immediate attention. Melanie's remains were left there. Her body was recovered by investigators in the days following her disappearance, after the search area was narrowed through evidence gathered at the apartment. The following day, people close to her began noticing something was wrong. She failed to appear for work. Calls went unanswered. Messages received no response. As the hours passed without contact, concern gradually turned into alarm. A missing person report was filed. The investigation quickly focused on Melanie's final known movements. Security footage from the apartment complex showed who entered the apartment that evening and documented the unusual activity that followed throughout the night. The recordings established a detailed timeline. Combined with phone records, vehicle information, forensic evidence, and the eventual recovery of Melanie's body, they provided a clear picture of what had occurred. A post-mortem examination determined that Melanie died from a gunshot wound. The evidence ultimately identified Nick as the person responsible for Melanie's murder and the concealment of her body. He was later convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Familiarity can make people feel safe. It can also make them lower their guard at exactly the wrong moment. For Melanie, that moment came behind her own front door.